Security seminar at Purdue University. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Jason Haas from Sandia National Labs, and he's going to talk about how to leverage safety applications for global revocation in vehicular ad hoc networks.
Thanks. So I particularly like this title for two reasons. One is it tends to be the longest title when I'm in a group of people presenting kind of in a similar situation as mine. And it also tends to be completely opaque and no one has a clue of what I'm talking about by the title. So I want to start off this talk just the way I start off almost every talk outside of the VANET workshop is who here knows what a vehicular ad hoc network is? 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm going to start. So vehicular ad hoc networks, so we're talking about here is vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-infrastructure as well. Kind of the main motivation for doing these things is safety applications, at least from the United States Department of Transportation perspective. And what we have going on here is you've got vehicles talking to other vehicles wirelessly, and they're sending information about where they are, where they're going, so position, velocity, acceleration, braking information. And we're doing this for the purposes of safety applications. We want to improve vehicle and driver safety, right? We want to mitigate crashes, reduce costs, reduce deaths, and the kind of supporting infrastructure under this is the wireless network. And there's a number of standards that are defining how this communication happens, how vehicles are communicating to each other. So there's standard IEEE 802.11p that's defining the MAC and PHY layers. So you've probably heard of .11a and .11b, G, N, right, for your Wi-Fi. .11p is specific to this vehicular environment. It's very similar to A. And as I mentioned, this is a broadcast environment, and vehicles are sending their state information about 10 times a second. Okay, so safety applications, right? This is the second opaque term in my title. What are safety applications? So a couple examples are intersection collision warning, safety application. So you can imagine you've got two vehicles approaching an intersection, and you want to warn a potentially inattentive driver that there isn't a potentially inattentive driver, that there's a collision about to happen. So the wireless communication is useful for this because intersections often you don't have line of sight to the other vehicle. So your wireless connection allows you to know about this other vehicle that's around a corner. Another example of a safety application is forward collision warning. So this is the situation where you're in some traffic and there's a vehicle ahead of you that's slowing down or stopped and you may not be realizing it, so you want to warn your driver that the situation is occurring so that the driver can then stop before there's actual collision. So at the end of each of these examples you see the word warning, and that's really the mode that we're operating under here, is we're warning drivers. We're not doing automated driving here. So this is kind of a first step. You could imagine that automated driving is going to happen someday, especially if you're Google. And so why is this an interesting problem? Why do we care about security? Well, in the United States, and this number is fairly consistent, though a little bit smaller than what I'm showing on this slide here in terms of more recent data. There's 250 million vehicles on the road in the United States. This is a very, very large network. And sometime next calendar year, US DOT is going to tell auto manufacturers what needs to go into vehicles to support these networks. So what needs to go in terms of radio, how things need to work together across auto manufacturers. So security in this arena is a little bit more, has higher consequences than a lot of kind of traditional environments where you would think about security. So in an enterprise network, you might lose a document, you might leak some information. While that's not great, and it has a monetary value to it, people don't necessarily die, right? If cars crash, this is a really bad thing. So how would you use these networks to cause vehicles to crash? Well, false positives, false negatives in your detection mechanisms for detecting collisions. So how would you induce a false positive? Well, I might just want to create a vehicle that doesn't really exist. And I'm going to make it look like it's right in front of you driving. And so now you, as a knee-jerk reaction, and a driver, being a good driver and being defensive, are going to jam on the brakes. Well, maybe there's someone following too close behind you. So now I've induced a crash that wouldn't otherwise have occurred. So this is why false positives are bad. False negatives are also bad. Right? This is the situation that there's a crash about to occur normally, and I do something to cause your vehicle not to detect it. But this is really not quite so interesting as false positives because this doesn't happen very frequently anyways. And if you're an attentive driver, then, well, even if you don't get the warning, you should see the crash happening. So there's other ways to mitigate this, and it just happens a lot less frequent. By the way, please feel free to jump in with questions or things you want clarified as we go here. So as Professor Nita Rotaro mentioned, I'm from Sandia National Labs, and we're a national security laboratory. So why is Sandia involved in this? Well, there are threats to national security here, right? Vehicles make up a good portion of our transportation critical infrastructure, so that's why this is important to us. What are the threats we're concerned about? Well, you could think about organized crime, using this as a means to do targeted attacks, right? Maybe there's some VIP that I want to cause a crash around, or that I want to delay or reroute. So they might be interested. Terrorists, they might want to delay first responders. So you could clog roadways by doing this. You could cause people to crash into first responders by doing this. Nation states also might have an interest in doing this. They, in terms of disrupting just the critical infrastructure, again, the transportation grid, or our economy in general, right? Lots of stuff, goods, and people move over these networks. Okay, beyond vehicular ad hoc networks, why is this interesting? Well, it applies to a lot of other areas that we're involved in. So you can think of Department of Defense. You've got tactical mobile ad hoc networks, soldiers talking to UAVs, talking to planes, talking to forward operating bases, things like that. And then the FAA, another part of USDOT, is interested in this, or I would hope would be interested in this, thinking about kind of the next generation air traffic control system called ADS-B. And this is essentially an airborne mobile ad hoc network where you have planes talking to other planes for the purposes of air traffic control. And kind of, it's funny how you give these talks and then you think about, well, what else can I say? And then, like a week or two before, someone publishes something else that's really relevant and interesting. So at DEF CON a month or so ago, there was at least one person who released a piece of software, or said they have a piece of software that can inject planes into this ADS-B system. So this is exactly the analog into the aircraft realm of the problem of creating these vehicles for false positives in the vehicular realm. And the reason that they can do this is there's no encryption and no authentication. So this is, as I'm saying, doing it wrong. Beyond that, we do a lot of work with other cyber-physical systems, including oil and gas and smart grid. And there's easy applications there too. So a little bit of background on how vehicular ad hoc networks work, and at least as the security applies to them. I like to show this graph in what I call the authorization cycle. So there's three pieces to this. There's a public key infrastructure that's being set up by a certificate authority. And then you've got vehicles and infrastructure that are going to make use of the PKI. So you've got this centralized piece that the CA is setting up that kind of owns the PKI. And you've got a decentralized piece. And so the implication here, and this is important for what I'm going to talk about later, is you've got the centralized, decentralized, where your authority is offline. Right? So if you needed to do some sort of misbehavior detection, this isn't going to be done by your authority. There has to be some reporting involved. Okay, so you set up this PKI, and you issue certificates to vehicles to say, hey, I think you're okay. I want you to use my network. Right? Because I don't want just some person with a laptop sitting by the side of the road creating fictitious vehicles to be on my network. Vehicles use those certificates to build authenticators, and I'm calling them authenticators and not signatures because they might not be signatures. but you can think of a version of authenticators of being a signature. Vehicles use the certificates to make these authenticators and attach them to messages to say, hey, I'm right here, and by the way, you should trust me because here's my certificate, and the CA trusts me, and I'm authenticating this message. So then a vehicle receives the message and has to make a decision of, okay, yay or nay, this is from an authorized source, but also, what are they telling me? Do I care? If I care, are they doing something that's interesting? Are they going to crash into me? Are they doing something that I think is wrong? If they're doing something that I think is wrong, then I'm going to make a decision that I'm calling revocation here. And this can be either local or global. So local would be essentially, I'm not going to trust you because you're telling me you're traveling faster than the speed of light or something ridiculous. And I know never to trust you again. But I can't prove that to anyone else, or may not be able to. Global revocation is the case where I claim something ridiculous, but I can take that claim and I can prove it to other people, so other people can benefit from that. So either way, or if it is global, and if I do want to do global revocation, then I'm going to do some misbehavior detection, and I'm going to report what I found back to the certificate authority. The certificate authority is then going to gather that information and make a decision on whether or not to revoke a vehicle globally. And if they are going to globally revoke a vehicle, they're going to distribute information back to other vehicles so that the other vehicles can benefit from that detection. And that might take the form of a certificate revocation list, especially since the CA is going to be offline, so you can't do online things. Okay, so there's some inherent assumptions behind what I just showed you. One is that we care about authorizing vehicles, right? We've said, okay, we don't want just anyone on this network. But also there are things that could happen that could cause me to spout out information that's not believable, right? I might have a malfunctioning sensor, and then I might also be malicious, right? I might just want to cause you to crash. So there's kind of two failure modes. The other thing that's really supporting all of this work is I'm assuming revocation is the best decision, right? That there are cases where I want other people to tell that you're bad, right? If you have attacked me, then I want other people to know that you're bad, and I want them not to trust you as well. So the assumption there is that people can do things that are detectable once but not necessarily detectable later. Okay, so why this is a hard problem is in part not only that your authority's offline, but I can't take my sensor readings and give them to you and say, here, look, this person's bad because, well, they said they were here, but my radar says, no, they weren't really there. Because, well, how do you know that you can trust me? That my radar was functioning correctly or that I didn't falsify my radar? So this last bullet here, global revocation does not obviate local revocation, is the point that just because I can do global revocation, that I can pass on information that you shouldn't trust this person, doesn't mean that you should ignore all of your sensors, right? If I can gather information locally, then I can just toss out lots of things, and I don't need to do a lot of this misbehavior reporting. So I don't increase traffic on the network, and I can make quicker decisions, right? So going back to this cycle here, information has to go back to the certificate authority, and they have to make a decision, which takes time. So you can do things locally that are going to be much faster than doing the global revocation as well. All right, so global revocation, what it really is essentially insider attacks. And how would you get insiders? There's a number of different ways that you can get insiders. You could have a vehicle that's captured, so it's actually under the control of an attacker. You could have a vehicle that's compromised, and there's been work over the last 2 years about how you might own a vehicle from remotely or from being inside the vehicle and get onto the internal systems of a vehicle. You might have coercion. This is a little bit more generic. This doesn't apply so much to the vehicular environment. I think it'd be extremely hard to convince a driver that he should crash his vehicle, if he's sane at least. And so my solution to this is to take a look at safety applications and their physical implications and use the physics of the problem as well as any sort of infrastructure support, infrastructure being roadways and map information, to design a safety application that you can effectively do global revocation with. So that's kind of the big takeaway piece. If you don't remember anything else, is use the physics. And I almost said, use the physics, Luke. But I didn't know if anyone would get that. So. All right. So when I was thinking about this problem, I was thinking, well, how do you induce a false positive? What is actually happening here? Well, what's happening is the attackers are crafting a packet or maybe a series of packets that are going to fulfill all the requirements of a safety application. So what is this? This is essentially a claim. Right? The attacker's making some claim of where he is, what he's doing. And then the question was, well, can we use this against him? Right? If he's making a claim, can we force him to claim something that's useful for us? And then I was thinking about the problem of, well, if I can't really tell if someone's lying to me or not, if I have no way of sensing them, right? If they're around the corner for like the intersection collision warning safety application, I can't use my radar to tell if they're actually where they're claiming to be. So I have this problem of I need to decide if someone's lying to me or not. But can we design... So this is really hard, and it may not even be possible to make that decision with sufficiently high accuracy. But can we design the safety application so that I don't have to tell, so that I can do global revocation without needing to decide whether or not what someone's telling me is true or not? So that's kind of this first goal here. So ICW, I haven't really introduced that acronym yet, is just intersection collision warning. So that's the safety application that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk. So can we design this safety application so that my misbehavior reporting isn't dependent on the truthfulness of either the reporter or the source? And specifically, what I kind of boiled it down to is, if we trigger a warning, can I reduce it to either the attacker or potential attacker, the person making the claim, is saying, I'm doing something legal and we're about to crash, or I'm doing something illegal and we're about to crash, or I'm claiming to do something illegal and we're not really going to crash, right? So this comes down to if he's doing something legal, well then he's not in the wrong, and maybe I should be warning myself in the detecting vehicle already ahead of this. Or if he's not doing something, or if he's claiming something, then it's either fictitious and it's not really there, but it's illegal, so I could fine him or I could revoke him. Either way, it doesn't matter, because it's something that we don't want to have happen. All right, so this picture, it's probably hard for people to read on the video, and it's all right, you don't really need to read it. Basically what I'm showing here is, these are the dynamics of the problem. So what do vehicles need to be doing in terms of where do they need to be, how fast do they need to be going to have an interesting collision, how do we define actually having a collision at an intersection. And kind of along the right-hand side there is all these rules, and there's a red line. Everything above that red line is kind of what existed in the safety application before I started working on it from this perspective. And the things below the red line are essentially rules that say, if we're going to have a warning, an intersection collision warning, I want the vehicle to be outside of the intersection when the claim is being made. And I want there to be a point inside the intersection that he cannot stop before. So this is just saying, no matter what you do, you cannot stop without entering the intersection anymore, based on the dynamics that you're claiming. In addition to that, the state of the control signal, be it red light or stop sign, is that you are supposed to stop. That is, you don't have the right-of-way. You don't have the right-of-way to enter the intersection. And there's no time between when you are making the claim and when you, this point inside the intersection, that your control signal is going to change. So you think about going really slow, right? It's red. Well, then there's going to be a time when it's green, and then it's going to be red again. Well, how do you handle that? Could they enter the intersection then? So this is saying you can't stop before you go in the intersection, and you don't have the right-of-way, so you're doing something illegal. That's just how you do it or how I've codified it. Okay, so those are the rules that I've added, or that I propose adding. But how do you evaluate this? Like, how does this compare to the old rules? Is this even necessary? So that's the first question. Is this just a moot point? Can you actually attack the old rules? And if you can, if you can attack them, and you do need these new rules, well then, how many wrongful revocations does this lead to, right? How much work is this going to create for people who are monitoring the system? And what's the impact that errors in, say, GPS or navigation units have on this wrongful revocation rate? And then furthermore, what impact does this have on safety applications? For the additional communication that you're introducing, does that degrade safety application performance? Or the new rules, does it make detecting collisions harder? Okay, so it turns out that it's really expensive and dangerous to crash vehicles or to even drive vehicles like you're going to crash them. So voila, let's turn to our favorite tool, simulation. So how I went about this is I started generating traces using a tool called Sumo, which is a simulator for urban mobility. And I forget what O means. Anyways, you can look this up. It's a tool that I've used in the past. And what I did is I simulated an urban environment that is essentially a 10 by 10 grid of city blocks, each block being 150 meters long. And there's 2 lanes on each road in each direction. Every intersection is stoplight controlled. And Sumo is really nice in that it gives you traces that are almost collision-free, but for when you're actually trying to detect collisions that you want to create, you need it to be completely collision-free, so there's some post-processing involved here. And for the simulations I'm going to show you, I simulated across 3 different density settings. And I'm measuring density essentially by how many vehicles enter the simulation area across 1,000 seconds. And the settings I used are 1,000, 2,000, and 5,000 vehicles. So the first question that I showed you was, well, is this really even interesting, right? Is it possible to attack this safety application with the old rules? And so I turned to simulation to do this, and the way I simulated my attacker was I made the attacker essentially omniscient. And the purpose in doing that was the attacker could do this could want to have a very targeted attack, right? So if you drive to work every day, your pattern of driving is very predictable. You go by the same things at the same times most every day. So I can anticipate that, and I can set up wherever I need to along that route. So that's why I'm modeling an attacker as being omniscient. So, well, you could ask the question, well, that works for a small number of vehicles, but why does it work for all the vehicles? Well, we want to gather statistics, right? So let's just do this for every vehicle and make him completely omniscient. The attacker's goal in my simulations is to create a packet that contains the dynamics of a vehicle that will set off the collision warning, all the rules for the collision warning, right? So he's got to fulfill all those rules that I showed you a couple slides back. So he has to essentially create a fictitious vehicle to satisfy all of them. And the way that I did this is just by using Monte Carlo methods. So he's going to just do a search over what are the necessary dynamics in terms of position, velocity, acceleration, that'll fulfill all of those requirements. So there's a couple constraints. As I mentioned, he's got to fulfill all the safety application criteria, but also there's realism constraints. So he can't just claim to be anywhere, do anything, right? There's other vehicles on the road. He can't be running into them, and he has to be on the road. He can't be driving through buildings and things like that. Okay, so here, this slide I'm showing the results of my simulation. And what I'm plotting here is I'm plotting what's the probability of successfully attacking a vehicle versus the distance that vehicle travels. So vehicles start at various points within this network, and they drive to certain other places within the network. And I'm showing this for the different density settings that I showed you earlier. So really the takeaway here is that with extremely high probability, in 90%, 99%, you can attack a vehicle in the low or medium density settings within about a kilometer, listening to them over a kilometer. So this is a couple city blocks. This is, 7 city blocks or so. you might be able to cover that with a single radio if you had used directional antennas. So that tells me that the barrier to entry to perform this attack is very low, and that this attack is very plausible. When you look at the higher density settings, which is this lower trace here of the green and blue solid lines, things get a little bit harder. You've got to watch over a longer period of time. And this is just simply because there's more vehicles on the roadway, so you to preserve realism, you have kind of less roadway to work with. All right. So that to me motivated adding these rules that there is an attack surface for the old intersection collision warning rules. But now what's the effect on revocation? Like, how many wrongful revocations will there be? How many false positives will there be in the safety application due to error in GPS or navigation systems? So what I did is I went back to my traces and modeled them, and I needed to remove things like, well, there's true positives, so these vehicles don't necessarily always obey all the traffic control signals, so I need to remove those from my simulations. And there's also funny things that Sumo likes to do, like when vehicles finish, they kind of just accelerate off into nowhere. So you need to kind of remove those things. And the way that I'm comparing this is I'm comparing old and new rules. I don't really have like a lot of absolute data in terms of how many intersections people are going through every day in the United States. So to parameterize my error settings, I looked at a couple of papers and some device data sheets, and I essentially extracted from them what's normal or worst case error in urban environments, right? So I'm simulating an urban environment. What's the error in GPS look like in terms of position and velocity error? So I extracted that, and that's the kind of the worst case that I found from a paper that was looking at this in downtown Calgary is what I'm going to call standard error. And I'm modeling error, what I'm going to show you in terms of standard deviations on a Gaussian distribution. And then I said, well, that's great. Downtown Calgary is probably bad, but I'm sure it's not as bad as, say, downtown New York City, where you've got really, really tall buildings all over the place. So let's take it and let's go to more extreme conditions as well. So I'm modeling error in both position and velocity. I'm not modeling error in acceleration. And the reason for doing that is the situations where we care about the errors is we're trying to predict what's going to happen when maximum braking occurs. So we're kind of setting what our acceleration is. So that's why I'm not looking at errors in acceleration. And for each of the data points that I'm going to show you, there's 1,000 trials for each setting. Okay, so this is showing the number or the average number of false positives or wrongful revocations per intersection for the high density settings, and this is for with my new rules added. And on my x-axis there, I'm showing error in position, and I'm showing it on the y-axis error in velocity. And my steps there are just half increments of the standard error. So I'm pointing out there that on the standard error conditions, there's about one wrongful revocation with my new rules in about 4 million intersections that you traverse. So this is kind of getting back to my point of, well, how bad is that really? Like, how much work is that going to make for people who run this system? Well, I don't really know that. So I'm going to make a relative comparison here instead of absolute. But when you get down to a little better situation in the error, so you reduce each of the velocity and the position error in half, you get down to 1 in about 12 million intersection traversals where you're going to have a wrongful revocation. So let's go at the opposite end of the scale. Let's go to worst case. When you've got 4.5 times that standard error, then you are looking at about 1 in 900,000 intersections traversed. But so that's reading off the position error there. Your position error is about 6.25 meters, so that's going to put you in different lanes then. So this is pretty bad. You might not even want to be broadcasting at this point. So this might not really ever occur in practice. All right, without my rules, it turns out to be a lot worse. So Again, this is the high density settings. And looking at the standard error conditions, now we have a false positive occurring in about 1 in every 140,000 intersection traversals. So this is more than an order of magnitude worse than without, or than with my rules. And if you look at the worst case, now we're at 1 in about 6,000 intersection traversals. So again, this is multiple orders of magnitude worse. This just kind of summarized that result, that you see this improvement across the different density settings. It's not quite as much of an improvement at the low density settings. That's simply because vehicles tend to drive more aggressively in the simulations that I've run here. There's fewer vehicles on the road. They can get closer to the intersections and brake harder because there's no one in front of them. Okay, so the other thing that I'm pointing out here is that if you paid attention, I had one slide that was called wrongful revocation and one slide that was called false positive rate. For the new rules, I was calling it wrongful revocation because it's just satisfying all the rules that are required to trigger the safety application without having an actual collision predicted. Right? I'm trying to say, is this person entering this intersection while the light is red, essentially, right? That's my detection in terms of what I'm going to report. So that's why I'm calling it wrongful revocation. An actual false positive, where you would warn your driver, would be even lower, so the benefits would be even more. So, but I haven't simulated that yet. So that's one of the second bullet there that I'm pointing out. Okay, so the other side of the coin is, what does the false negative rate look like? And the way that I simulated this is I took my traces and I injected collisions at intersections into them, and then I'm just going to measure how many collisions were detected. Okay, so the old rules this time first, and I'm going to look at the low density settings. For standard error conditions, there are no false negatives here. And the other thing I'd like to point out, I should have pointed this out earlier, is that there's no wireless communication being modeled here, right? That's just going to induce extra loss that are going to increase these rates. And then you see also, you only get non-zero false negatives when you get to the higher position error settings. And these, again, might be conditions that never occur. But we're looking at 1.5% to 2% false negative rate at most at these worst error conditions. Okay, so when you add in the new rules, I'm only adding rules, so I'm only going to be excluding things that would have otherwise been detected, so it must go up, and indeed it does. So when you look at the standard error conditions here, we're looking at false negative rates of 0.7%, which is still pretty low. And but when you look at the larger error conditions, we're getting much, much worse here. We're orders of magnitude worse, right? So this isn't so great. But again, this might never happen. You might not trust your GPS signal enough to broadcast even in this regime. Okay, so then in looking at in trying to figure out what's going on here, I was looking at what's the contribution to the false negatives from just having the new rules. So without doing before you do the collision detection piece, what is the false negative rate? And it turns out to be a very small contribution here. So it's 0.1% at the standard error conditions, and I have a pointer to the wrong place on that graph, so you just have to imagine it extended. So really, the false negatives come in adding these new rules in the combination, and not so much from just having the rules themselves. So when you do the combination of needing the intersection test plus needing the collision detection, that's where you're getting the more false negatives. Okay, so this table here is summarizing just the comparison between the old and new rules for standard error and worst case error. And by adding the new rules, as you'd expect, there's strictly more false negatives with the new rules than without them. But for the standard error, they're very comparable. It's really only in the extreme cases that you get kind of a deviation of the results. Okay, so just to summarize, the contribution that I'm really kind of showing off here is that by adding these new rules, you give a mechanism to perform misbehavior detection that's useful for global revocation that didn't exist before. And you get the side benefit of reducing your false positives, which, as I mentioned before, is the case of most traffic, right? So this is the case that's going to result in the most work for people monitoring the system that you want to reduce. And the false negatives are more in the kind of standard error conditions, and quite a bit more for the extreme cases, but the extreme cases might not matter simply because you might choose not to be broadcasting during those times. So again, as I pointed out before, kind of the broad theme that I'm trying to encourage here is use the physics in your cyber physical systems to influence how you do security. So you're not just doing arbitrary data transmission. So that's kind of the take-home message that I have. But I'd be happy to take any other questions. I thank you for your attention. If people want to talk about vehicular ad hoc networks, that'd be great. If people want to talk about other vehicle security or cyber physical systems, or what do you do out in the desert at Sandia National Labs, I'd be happy to do that. This is an interactive class, is it not?
Since vehicles cost a lot of money anyways, can you invest a lot of money and make sure that whatever device on a vehicle can't be compromised, can't be tampered with? You could put it attached to the engine such that it's really hard to get it off the engine. Usually you can't spend that kind of money, but since the vehicle's costing $20,000 anyways, maybe it's worth it to put a lot of effort into that, and you could reduce a lot of these insider attacks that way.
Right. Yeah. So that's definitely been looked at. My interactions with vehicular manufacturers is they're very, very cost conscious. So pennies matter. So whether or not that'll happen, I'm not sure. You could imagine, though, you can get onto vehicles in other ways, and that's kind of segueing into other vehicular security. Is there's been work over the last 2 years by UW and UCSD on the security of modern automobiles, and you can get onto them quite a number of other ways, even simply by playing a song, apparently. So yeah, you could invest a lot there, and I think there's some definite return on investment by doing that in terms of reducing your headaches later.
So were there any other safety applications that you look at?
So I'm looking at the forward collision warning safety application right now. The reason I chose intersection collision warning is it's one that I've worked with previously, and it has the nice benefit of being very well defined. So you get that support from having a known intersection. And the forward collision warning can happen pretty much anywhere, so there's less support there. That makes it a much more complicated problem. I don't have anything that's a good solution, I think, for that right now.
Yeah, I remember a few years back I saw a talk, I think it was somebody from Honda or Toyota, and they were, all the examples that they had were with the intersection collision, and when they really played it slowly, you could actually see that it was obvious that something was about to happen.
Yes.
So it seems that it's one of the application where actually you can prevent it from happening. So.
Yes. Yeah. So there are the intersection collision warning, I think, is probably one of the more interesting in terms of VANET applications, because you need that non-line of sight. Right, for the forward collision warning, well, you've got a forward-looking radar probably on cars in the future. So if there's someone braking in front of you, you don't need the wireless communication to predict it. You know, if there are multiple vehicles in front of you, then maybe you do. So it's actually, I think that was actually probably Toyota, and that was probably, those videos were part of our motivation.
So that's why I don't remember which one. I think it may have been a panel at Mobicom or something like that.
Yeah.
So another question to continue on this, because you mentioned briefly something related to air traffic controller,
Yeah.
and at least when it comes down to plane ride, they have these devices that actually they're supposed to exchange information that prevents them from colluding unless the pilot overrides. So did you look at that? Are you aware of what would be the main issues there, and how maybe some of the things that you've done in this context can be applied in that context?
So that's something I'm looking into right now, and it's a very similar environment in that you're broadcasting information. So I think I mentioned that there's no authentication being done, no encryption. So they could have really benefited from a lot of the work in the VANET community as well. But on the other hand, it doesn't work exactly the same, and I'm just starting to understand that.
So I had in a class last year, don't ask me how, but two of the students were actually pilots. So and they were flying here at Purdue. So there was one student that was looking, or at least some of the security provisioning in this. I forgot the name of this new air traffic controller system that it's supposed to happen eventually, which is much more distributed in nature. And it seemed to me that changes fundamentally the trust model with respect to the current system right now. So that's something to maybe look at.
Yeah. It's a much smaller scale network. You've got, 250 million vehicles on the road. I think, if I recall, there's maybe like 50,000 planes in the U.S., so quite a bit less. Don't quote me on that. But.
Yeah, and last but not least, I actually, and I know that this sounds a little bit more futuristic, I actually saw a few years back a paper where people were looking at the flights across the Atlantic Ocean to actually establish a communication network where you could basically forward information from one plane. I think it was a Mobicom paper too. So that really reminded me of basically a mobile network, but obviously different scale, operating at different speed, and
right. Yeah.
But definitely the application there was more of just disseminating data basically. So it was not control information or.
Yeah, there's so there are other applications for VANETs that people have talked about. Kind of the one that I think is probably the most likely is intelligent transportation systems. So this might be passing on information about road congestion or weather or things like that, where drivers might use it to change their route to avoid the congestion. People have also talked about kind of commercial applications, so passing out coupons as you go by McDonald's or whatever, someplace for an oil change. But I think really the driving force is the safety applications. At least US DOT seems to be driving it that way, my understanding. Okay, so I glossed over a lot of other things, like how do you do authentication, how do you do revocation, distribute revocation information. We can talk about that if people are interested.
So for revocation, we have a system might be broken currently on the internet for trying to you try to authenticate websites, and if a website's acting badly, you want to revocate it. Mm-hmm. But currently, browsers don't even support it usually, or they don't check the revocation lists. What are the big challenges here with revoking keys?
So I think distributing the information is a bigger challenge here. So with people's browsers, when they're using them, they're online. So you can do things like you can have online protocols like OCSP. And so that's not the case here. So you've got to figure out some way to get that information out. And what we've done in the past is look at, let's just pass it epidemically. So when you hear someone say, I've got version N, and version n+1 is the latest, and you have it, you just send the delta between n and n+1. And then, compare that to if you pass it simply from building up a lot of infrastructure. And that's actually one of the bigger questions in this area is how much infrastructure support is there going to be, and who's going to build it? So what's the motivation? And so we've, or at least I've approached this problem previously with the assumption that there's not going to be a lot of infrastructure support, and certainly in the current budget situation we're in, that seems to be the case. But so then that motivated this research, and by doing some simulations, we were showing that even if you put, a couple hundred radios out there, you don't do as well as this epidemic passing. If you just kind of flood every time that you hear someone say that they don't have the latest version. So, and that was the VANET 2008 workshop. I think we published that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, no, I tried to get him to